I've been a truck driver for almost 13 years, and in 2015, something strange happened to me. That night, I was driving through the Mojave Desert in California, heading towards Arizona on an overnight haul. I can't quite recall what I was transporting, but it was probably household appliances. Around me was total darkness, and my truck's headlights were dim since I had been putting off repairs. Normally, I didn't notice the difference, but because there were hardly any other cars on the road, the lack of light felt more obvious. I had to squint every few minutes to make out the road ahead, creating an eerie atmosphere like something out of a horror story. I had considered pulling over and waiting for dawn, but I didn't want to waste time because I needed the money. Despite knowing it wasn't entirely safe to continue driving in those conditions, I decided to press on, thinking the road was pretty much a straight shot, so there wouldn't be any real danger. About an hour before sunrise, I saw something quickly approaching in the distance. Worried it might be an animal, I slammed on the brakes. When the truck screeched to a stop, I realized what was in front of me was a car with its hazard lights flashing, parked right in the middle of the road, on the double yellow lines. Stranger still, the passenger door was wide open. My truck had stopped only a few feet away from it. I'm not someone who scares easily, and I know how to protect myself, so instead of being scared, I was curious. I figured someone might need help, so I reversed a bit and pulled over to the side of the road. I thought about setting off a few flares, but decided against it since I hadn't seen a single car out there besides this one. I got out of my truck and walked toward the car. The night was eerily calm and warm, with absolutely no wind. It struck me as strange. The only sound in the vast desert silence was the ticking of the hazard lights. As I got closer, I realized it was a red Ford Fusion, looking relatively new. I approached it cautiously because, as I mentioned, the passenger door was wide open. I circled the car and came to an abrupt halt. The car was completely empty. I checked the back seat and anywhere else someone might be hiding, but no one was there. At that point, I started feeling uneasy about the situation. I had expected to find someone who had perhaps fallen asleep in a stupid spot, but the reality was completely different. The car was empty, and no one was around. I glanced over my shoulder a few times, growing more and more nervous. I kept looking in all directions, expecting someone to rush at me from the shadows. The darkness was so thick, I couldn't see beyond the area lit by my truck's headlights. It was an incredibly unsettling feeling. I stood there for a while, debating whether I should just get back in my truck and forget the whole thing. But against my better judgment, I decided to keep investigating. I peeked inside the car, but everything seemed completely normal. The keys were still in the ignition, but the engine was off. I stepped back out and walked around to the trunk, figuring I might as well check it out. The trunk was locked, but I took the keys from the ignition and tried to open it. However, it wouldn't budge. It seemed to be jammed from the inside. I decided to try from the back seat, and to my surprise, this time the trunk popped open. Inside were 3 garbage bags crammed tightly together and a rope securing the trunk shut. Before I reached for them, I remember glancing around one more time. Everything was clear. I was about 5 inches away from one of the bags when the loudest gunshot I'd ever heard rang out through the night. I smacked my head on the roof of the car in shock. Without thinking, I threw the keys onto the front seat and ran from the car as fast as I could. As I scrambled back into my truck, I heard a man's voice shouting from the distance. He yelled, "Hey," over and over, and his voice was getting closer fast. I jumped into the truck and frantically tried to start it. I swore repeatedly as the engine stalled at first, and that's when I saw him. As my truck started to roll, I saw a short, heavy-set man with red hair standing at the trunk of the car. He was wearing coveralls and boots that went up to his calves. In his left hand, he held a small shovel. In his right, an old-looking shotgun. We locked eyes for a few seconds as my truck passed him. He didn't move. I remember that he didn't look crazy. There was worry on his face. As I drove past, he dropped the shovel and started waving his hands. He kept yelling, "Wait!" several times, but there was no way I was stopping. I floored the gas and drove much faster than I usually would. After about 5 minutes, I started thinking I'd gotten away, but then I saw the headlights of another vehicle approaching quickly from behind. Fear gripped me when I realized it was the Ford. I called the police and reported the incident as best I could. The car was right behind me, honking continuously. I didn't know what else to do, so I just kept driving, praying he wouldn't try to ram me. After about 15 minutes of this, the car cut me off and slammed on the brakes, forcing me to slow down. I nearly hit the car when, finally, I saw the flashing lights of a police car up ahead. The Ford swerved off to the right and sped into the desert, disappearing into the darkness. I stopped and waited for the officer to approach. I was frantic as I told him what had happened, but he just took my statement instead of going after the guy. I was furious. I told the officer twice that he could catch up to the man if he left right then. But the cop told me not to worry and that they'd conduct a thorough search when backup arrived. Then he told me to continue on my way and said they'd call me if there were any updates. They never did. I've told this story countless times to my friends, and everyone always thinks that guy was burying a body. But with such a small shovel and those garbage bags, I prefer to think he was dealing with an animal rather than a person. Even so, after that night, I've never felt completely comfortable driving through the desert at night again. I'm sure you've seen those modern videos where truck drivers record their daily journeys and share tips with each other on social media. Or maybe you haven't. But since I'm one of the younger guys in this industry, whenever I open TikTok or YouTube Shorts, that's what I see. I won't go into details, but due to some personal reasons, I had to drop out of a prestigious university, and people always tell me I could have done more than just becoming a truck driver. Honestly, this job isn't that bad. I've been delivering goods for over 2 years now. The hardest part of this job, clearly, is the long hours. You'll never fully grasp how solitude can affect you until you experience it. My only advice is to come to terms with whatever demons lurk in your mind, because they'll take over during those long, lonely hours on the road. That's what happened to me. The incident occurred about 3 months into my first trucking job. I was still pretty much a rookie in the business. That day, I was driving from southern New Jersey to Lafayette, Indiana. A 12-hour drive. Driving for 12 hours straight doesn't sound too crazy, but if you add the fact that I had just completed an 8-hour trip before that, you'll understand the context. I wanted to finish the deliveries as quickly as possible, so I decided to drive through the night. I was expecting to get to Lafayette around 3 a.m. At first, everything was going smoothly. The road was almost completely empty, and there were barely any other cars, so I could push my truck to go faster than usual. Around the halfway point, I remember reaching for a Red Bull can, but there wasn't any left. Of course, I had forgotten to restock after my previous delivery. Frustrated, I smacked the dashboard, knowing I'd have to stop somewhere. I hate stopping during my trips more than anything else. Maybe it's just me, but I always feel 100 times more tired when my truck stops, even if it's just for 20 seconds. Looking at the navigation map, I realized I didn't have many choices. Either fall asleep at the wheel or stop for an energy drink. Both options seemed equally bad to me at that point. Reluctantly, I pulled into the first service station I saw. I had no idea where I was at the time, probably somewhere in Ohio. It wasn't long before I realized that this wasn't a normal service station. It looked like an abandoned gas station with a convenience store that had been repurposed. I'm not sure how else to describe it, but that's the vibe I got. Anyway, I saw another convenience store not far up the road and thought I'd go there if needed. I parked the truck and walked up to the first store. Honestly, I was expecting one of two things. Either it would be open or the door would be locked. You can imagine my surprise when the door opened, but the inside was completely dark. I looked around, hoping to find some leftover drinks or snacks. Just as I was about to turn back, my eyes adjusted to the darkness, and I saw a faint light coming from the corner of the room. I walked closer and realized the light was coming from a back room. Curiosity got the best of me, and I slowly opened the door. To my surprise, there was an old refrigerator still plugged into the wall. I eagerly opened the fridge, but there was nothing inside. The shelves had been removed as if someone had cleaned the whole thing out. As I was closing the fridge door, I was 90% sure I heard something fall to the floor in the main room. I stood still for about 10 seconds. Did I imagine that? No way. I quietly went back to the main room and looked around. Nothing. Part of me wanted to investigate further, but I didn't have time for that. I left the store and almost sprinted to the other convenience store. Thankfully, that one was open. I quickly grabbed an energy drink and headed back to my truck. Something about the whole stop felt off, and I knew I needed to get back on the road immediately. I took one last glance at the abandoned store and noticed that the door was now open. I was absolutely sure I had closed it before, but I didn't want to think too much about it, so I started my truck and merged back onto the highway. The caffeine started kicking in, and I was wide awake again. My mind began to wander, and I started thinking about how weird the whole situation had been. I guess it wasn't too strange that a homeless person could have been squatting in the abandoned building, but I couldn't shake the strange feeling about the fridge. I tried to brush it off and continued driving. That's when I started noticing something odd moving behind the curtain in the back of the truck. Sweat began to form on my forehead. I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the curtain slightly puffing and shifting, even though I hadn't turned the air conditioning on. My mind jumped to the worst possible scenario. Someone was hiding in my truck. I didn't have any weapons, so I discreetly set my GPS to the nearest police station on my phone. The next 20 minutes were the most nerve-wracking of my life. I kept imagining that whoever it was would jump out and attack me or try to wreck the truck. Finally, as I neared the police station, I parked the truck as close as possible and bolted toward the station in seconds. The cops immediately surrounded my truck, and when they opened the back door, what they found will haunt me forever. The police pulled out 3 people who looked homeless, 2 men and a woman. They were wearing tattered clothes and wrapped in filthy blankets. One of the men was carrying 2 switchblades. All 3 of them refused to speak and just stared at me with unsettling eyes as they were handcuffed. I have no idea what they wanted, and I'll probably never find out. Before we dive into the next story, if you're here for the first time, let me know where you're tuning in from. Be sure to subscribe to our channel and hit the bell icon so you don't miss any of the upcoming scary stories. We appreciate your support. Feel free to share these stories with your friends and family. Thank you. My name is Henry, and I've been a truck driver for over 13 years, working for various companies. By now, the job has become second nature to me. Pick up the load, make sure the goods are correct, and then deliver them to the destination. Since we don't get paid by the hour, efficiency is the name of the game. For someone like me, with years of experience, I like to think I can get things done faster than the younger guys just starting out, but that's not always a good thing. Sometimes I push myself to the limit, working without nearly enough sleep. About 4 years ago, I was working for a warehouse in North Dakota. For those who don't know, North Dakota is one of the flattest states, which makes driving trucks a bit easier. This also means skipping a few hours of sleep could be the difference between keeping your job and getting fired. It was a cool morning in May, and it was the start of the week, which meant there were plenty of shipments to be delivered. I wanted to knock out as many as I could in one go, so I mapped out my route to Montana without any planned stops. I started driving a few hours after lunch and figured I'd get to my destination by the early morning. I pushed the truck as fast as I could, maybe even a little faster than I should have. It was getting pretty late, and I remember rubbing my eyes to shake off the sleep as the clock ticked past midnight. I was struggling to keep my eyes open, but I was only about an hour from my destination, so I gritted my teeth and kept going. A buddy of mine named Tristan, also a trucker, had introduced me to smelling salts when I first started out. In case you don't know, smelling salts are these small vials with crystals inside that you sniff, and it jolts you awake instantly. Tristan warned me that using them too often could be dangerous. They sting your nose, but whenever I need a quick wake-up, I reach for the salts. This was one of those times. I took a strong sniff and instantly felt the adrenaline rush through my body. I hoped the feeling would last for the rest of the drive. About half an hour passed, and I started feeling drowsy again. The rumble strip on the side of the road jolted me awake when the truck veered slightly. That's when I realized this was becoming dangerous. I needed to stop. The highway was completely empty at that point, but both sides were lined with trees, and there wasn't a good place to pull over. I slowed down, scanning for a safe spot to stop. At this slower speed, the truck's headlights pierced deeper into the darkness, allowing me to see more. And then I noticed something strange. A purple dress was lying in the middle of the road. What the hell? I thought, rubbing my eyes. Was I hallucinating? I blinked several times, trying to make sure I wasn't seeing things. But there it was, a purple dress. I drove over it, glancing at it as my truck rolled by. In hindsight, that should have been a bigger red flag, but I was too tired to think straight. About 200 yards ahead, I saw a pair of shoes. That's when the anxiety started creeping in. What the hell is going on? I thought, hoping I'd find a place to stop soon. I clutched my dad's old cross. My father, Peter, was a devout man, and prayed he would help me through this situation. As I kept driving, I saw more clothes scattered along the road, including children's clothing. This time I stopped the truck. Panic was setting in. Something was really, really wrong. I sat in the driver's seat, waiting for something to happen, but nothing did. Following my instincts, I got out of the truck to check things out. The cool morning air hit my skin and helped wake me up a bit. I cautiously approached the clothing. It was definitely children's clothes, both boys and girls. I looked around into the woods, but it was too dark to see much of anything. I kept turning around, worried that this could be a trap. Feeling uneasy, I headed back to the truck. Right then, I heard a noise to my left. I whipped around, trying to see what made the sound. I stood there, waiting for another noise. After about 30 seconds, there was another sound, this time from across the road. My survival instincts kicked in, and I bolted back to the truck. I jumped into the driver's seat, but before I could close the door, I heard a child's scream. My heart was pounding. I was torn between facing strangers in the woods and possibly saving innocent kids. Before I could make a decision, another scream, exactly like the first one, echoed through the night. Without thinking, I started the truck and drove toward the direction of the scream. My headlights illuminated the woods about 30 yards ahead, and I saw 3 or 4 people there, one of them holding a large speaker. As my headlights hit them, they ducked behind trees, but I saw enough to know what they were doing. They were trying to lure me into the woods with fake child screams from the speaker. I just sat there, stunned, staring into the forest where they had hidden. I reached for my phone to call the police, but before I could dial, I heard a loud thud against the side of my truck. Someone had thrown something from the other side. That was the last straw. I spun the truck around and floored it. As I sped away, I saw another person on the other side of the road. He yelled something I couldn't make out and hurled an object at the truck, shattering my passenger side window. I drove for the next hour in complete silence, too terrified to process what had just happened, but there was no way I was stopping to sleep in that forest. After I finished the delivery, I passed out, sleeping for 10 straight hours. When I woke up, the first thing I did was call the police. They said they'd investigate the area and would let me know if they found anything. Looking back, I feel stupid for getting out of the truck in the first place. I should have minded my own business, but the thought of children being in danger was too much to ignore. To this day, I have no idea what those people were planning. I don't know why they didn't rush me when they had the chance, or what they would have done if I had gone into the woods to save those kids. In all my years as a truck driver, I've never had an experience as strange or terrifying as that one. It was one of those nights where the road seemed to stretch on endlessly. The dark asphalt rolled out before me, illuminated only by the headlights of my truck. The clock on the dashboard read 11:45 p.m., and I could feel the fatigue slowly taking over my body. My eyelids were heavy, and I knew I had to find a place to pull over and rest before I lost control of the wheel. After driving a few more miles, I saw a sign for a rest area ahead. It wasn't big, just a small spot with a couple of picnic tables and a restroom, but it would suffice. I signaled, exited the highway, and slowly pulled into the rest stop. As soon as I parked, I realized the place was completely deserted. There wasn't another car in sight. The silence was eerie, broken only by the faint hum of my truck's engine. I found a spot near the edge of the lot, away from the restroom building, and turned off the engine. The headlights dimmed, leaving me in near total darkness. The only light came from a weak street lamp, casting a faint glow over the truck. I leaned back in my seat, adjusting it for comfort. The weight of sleep was pulling me in, and the stillness almost felt comforting. I closed my eyes, hoping to catch a few hours of rest before hitting the road again. But just as I was about to drift off, I heard a noise. At first, it was so faint that I wasn't sure I had heard anything at all. I opened my eyes and listened, trying to make out the sound in the thick silence. There it was again, a soft whispering. It was too distant to understand what was being said, but it was there. I brushed it off as the wind or maybe an animal rustling in the bushes. I closed my eyes again, but the whispering didn't go away. It seemed to be getting closer. Now the sound was clearer, like someone muttering to themselves. My heartbeat quickened and a chill ran down my spine. I shot upright, fully awake now, and looked out the window. There was nothing, just the dark parking lot and the shadowy outlines of the picnic tables. The whispering continued, growing louder, and finally, I could make out some words. They were disjointed and unclear, but carried a menacing tone. It sounded like someone angrily muttering, very close but still hidden. I flicked on the interior light, my hand reaching for the door handle, but something inside me stopped me. A deep, primal instinct warned me to stay inside, lock the doors, and not get out. Every part of me screamed that something was terribly wrong. The whispering was right outside the truck now, right by the driver's side door. I held my breath, slowly turning my head toward the window. That's when I saw him. A face, pale and twisted, pressed against the glass, staring directly at me. His eyes were wide, bloodshot, and his mouth twisted into a grin that made my skin crawl. In his hand, he clutched a long, jagged knife, the blade faintly glinting in the weak light. For a moment, I was completely frozen, unable to move or think. My mind struggled to make sense of what I was seeing. Was this real? Was I dreaming? But the man outside didn't wait for me to figure it out. He raised the knife and tapped it lightly against the glass, the sound sharp and chilling. His grin widened, and I could see his lips moving, though I couldn't hear anything over the thudding of my heart. Panic flooded my body, breaking me free from the paralysis. My hands trembled as I fumbled for the keys, jamming them into the ignition and twisting them hard. The engine roared to life, and I quickly shifted into gear. The man didn't move. He just kept staring, kept tapping that knife against the window. I slammed on the gas, the tires screeching as they gripped the pavement. The truck lurched forward, and I sped away from the rest area without daring to look back. Adrenaline surged through me, my hands shaking as I gripped the steering wheel, racing down the highway. Even after I had put several miles between me and that place, I couldn't shake the image of his face, his eyes, that knife. The whispering still echoed in my ears, like a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see him following, his twisted grin reflecting in the darkness. It wasn't until I saw the bright lights of a truck stop ahead that I began to feel the slightest bit of relief. I pulled in, parked under the bright lights, and let out a long breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw him standing there, smiling, that knife in his hand. To this day, I avoid those isolated rest areas, those places where the darkness seems to swallow everything. I don't know who that man was or what he wanted, but I do know one thing. If I hadn't gotten out of there when I did, I might not be here to tell the tale. That night left me with a fear I'll never shake, a chill that runs down my spine every time I think about it. The road can be a lonely place, but sometimes it's what hides in the darkness that's truly terrifying. The highway stretched out in front of me, long and dark, with no end in sight. The night was quiet, the kind where the only thing you hear is the soft hum of the engine and the occasional gust of wind. I'd been driving for hours, and fatigue was creeping up on me. I decided to take the next exit ramp, hoping to stretch my legs and clear my mind. I saw the sign for an exit up ahead, and without much thought, I took it. The ramp led me to a desolate road, flanked by fields and a few scattered, scraggly trees. Not a soul was around, and the only light came from the dim glow of my truck's headlights. I pulled onto the gravel shoulder, cut the engine, and stepped out into the cool night air. The stillness of the night was almost unnerving, but I needed the break. I lit a cigarette, took a slow drag, and blew the smoke into the darkness, watching it drift away. As I stood there, relishing the moment of quiet, I heard something that made the hair on my arms stand up, a child's giggle. It echoed from somewhere nearby, but when I looked around, there was no one. The sound was so out of place that I almost questioned if I'd imagined it. But before I could process it fully, a tiny, high-pitched voice broke through the silence. "Hi, mister." I froze. My heart skipped a beat. My first thought was, what the hell is a kid doing out here in the middle of nowhere at this hour? I scanned the area again, trying to locate the source of the voice, but there was no one in sight. The fields were barren, and the trees too far away for anyone to hide behind. I was unsettled, but trying to stay calm. I called out, "Where are you?" Almost immediately, the voice responded, "My mommy says you'll be okay. Don't worry." What the hell did she mean by that? And where was her mom? The more I thought about it, the more uneasy I felt. I waited, hoping she'd say more, but the night fell silent again. No sign of the little girl who had just spoken. Suddenly, I felt something, like someone was standing right next to me. It wasn't hostile, but it was definitely unsettling. It felt like an invisible presence, close enough that I could sense it. The hair on the back of my neck stood up and my heart raced. I glanced around again, seeing nothing, but the feeling stayed. Odd as it was, the presence didn't feel dangerous. In fact, it was almost comforting, like someone or something was watching over me. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the eerie sensation, finished my cigarette, and crushed it under my boot. As unsettling as it all was, I figured it was best to get back on the road. No need to linger any longer. I climbed back into my truck, started the engine, and pulled back onto the highway. As I drove, the uneasy feeling began to fade, the steady hum of the road beneath me soothing my nerves. But just as I started to relax, the fuel light on the dashboard flickered on. "Damn it," I muttered. I'd forgotten to refuel earlier, and now the gas gauge was dangerously low. I pulled up the GPS, quickly searched for the nearest truck stop, and found one just a few miles away. I set the course, praying I'd make it before the tank ran dry. The miles seemed to drag on, and I watched the fuel gauge sink lower with each passing minute. My chest tightened as the engine started sputtering. But just as I was about to lose hope, I spotted the lights of the truck stop in the distance. Relief washed over me as I steered the truck toward the pumps. The engine gave one last cough before I coasted in, barely making it to the fuel line before the truck died completely. I sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel, trying to calm my nerves. I had made it by the skin of my teeth. I stepped out, ready to fill up the tank, when something caught my eye. Just at the edge of the truck stop's light, I saw her. The same little girl from the exit ramp. She stood there, softly giggling, her form almost blending into the shadows. It didn't make sense, but there she was, staring at me with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. It was the kind of smile that makes you want to run, but somehow you can't. My mind raced. Was she real? Was she a ghost? And what did she mean earlier when she said I'd be okay? I didn't stick around to find out. I hurriedly filled up the tank, my hands trembling as I worked. Once I was done, I glanced back to where she had been standing, but she was gone. The corner was empty, as if she had never been there at all. I jumped back into my truck, slammed the door shut, and sped out of the truck stop as fast as I could. Even on the open highway, where it felt safer despite the surrounding darkness, I couldn't shake the feeling of having encountered something not of this world. Her words kept playing in my head. "My mommy says you'll be okay. Don't worry." I glanced at the rearview mirror a few times, half expecting to see her standing there watching me. I couldn't help but wonder if she had been looking out for me or if her words had been a warning. Either way, I knew one thing for sure. I wouldn't be stopping at any more deserted off-ramps anytime soon. I've spent countless nights driving down empty highways, just me, the steady hum of my truck, and the endless road ahead. Some people might find that kind of solitude eerie, maybe even unsettling. But for me, it's always been comforting. It's where I can clear my head, where I can just be alone with my thoughts. But there was one night, a night I still can't forget, that left me with a chill that lingers to this day. It was close to midnight, and I was on a remote stretch of road deep in the middle of nowhere. The sky was pitch black, no stars to guide the way, only a thick blanket of darkness. The road was completely empty, which wasn't unusual for that hour, and the only light came from my truck's headlights slicing through the night. There was something heavy in the air, a strange tension that made my skin crawl. I couldn't quite figure out what it was, but it was enough to make me feel uneasy. My instincts were on high alert, though I couldn't explain why. Maybe it was the isolation, or the oppressive silence, or maybe it was something else. As I continued down the highway, I spotted something up ahead. At first, I thought my mind was playing tricks on me, but as I got closer, I realized it was a woman standing by the side of the road, her thumb out, signaling for a ride. She was dressed in a light, flowing dress, odd for such a cold night, and her hair whipped around slightly in the breeze. My first thought was to slow down. It's not every day you see a lone woman hitchhiking in the dead of night, in the middle of nowhere. It felt strange. Something about the situation didn't sit right with me. But I couldn't just leave her there. What if she was in real trouble? Just as I was about to pull over, I caught something in my peripheral vision, movement in the bushes behind her. It was subtle, just a rustling of leaves, but enough to make me slam on the brakes. I squinted into the darkness, trying to make out what was there. That's when I saw them. A group of men crouched low in the shadows, watching, waiting. I couldn't see their faces clearly, but it was obvious they were poised to act. They must have thought I hadn't noticed them, but I did. And in that moment, everything clicked. The woman wasn't just a hitchhiker, she was bait. A trap set to lure unsuspecting drivers like me. If I had stopped, those men would have ambushed me. What would have happened after that? I didn't want to stick around to find out. Without hesitation, I slammed my foot on the gas. My truck roared to life, speeding past the woman. I glanced at her just in time to see her face change. Her calm expression shifted to one of panic, almost desperation. And that's when the men sprang from the bushes, racing toward my truck. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. They were fast, much faster than I expected. The woman ran too, right alongside them, her arms pumping as she tried to keep up. They all chased after my truck like a pack of predators after their prey. My heart pounded in my chest as I floored the gas pedal. The truck surged forward, barreling down the road. I could hear their footsteps growing louder, echoing in the night as they closed in. I didn't dare look in the mirrors. I didn't want to see how close they were. I just kept my eyes fixed on the road, praying my truck could outrun them. The road stretched on forever, with no end in sight. The darkness around me felt like it was pressing in, suffocating me. Adrenaline coursed through my veins, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tight, my knuckles turned white. But no matter how fast I drove, they didn't let up. I could hear their voices now, shouting at me, though I couldn't make out the words. Fear twisted into a hard knot in my chest. This wasn't just a random attack. These people were determined to catch me. Then, just when I thought they would reach the truck, the road took a sharp turn. It was the kind of bend that could easily send you off the road if you weren't careful. I didn't slow down. I took the curve at full speed, feeling the truck tilt dangerously as it hugged the road. I prayed the tires wouldn't give out, that the truck wouldn't flip. As I rounded the bend, I risked a glance in the rearview mirror. The road behind me was empty. They were gone. I didn't ease up on the gas, though. I kept driving, putting as much distance between me and that place as possible. The fear stayed with me, lingering like a shadow, even after I reached the next town. My heart was still racing, my hands trembling as I pulled into a gas station and parked. That night, I didn't sleep. Instead, I sat in my truck, staring out into the darkness, waiting for the first light of dawn. I couldn't shake the feeling that those people were still out there, watching, waiting for their next victim. Since that night, I've driven that same highway many times, but I've never seen that woman or those men again. Still, every time I pass by that stretch of road, I get the same cold shiver running down my spine. It's a constant reminder of how close I came to something terrible. And every time, I make sure to keep my eyes on the road, my foot steady on the gas, and my senses sharp. Because out there, in the darkness, you never know what's lurking, waiting for you. I've been a truck driver for various companies for the past 10 years. About 3 years ago, I was working for a logistics company in Kansas, handling shipments. Most of the time I drove a semi-truck, and that's what I was behind the wheel of on February 2nd. It was a cold Monday, the beginning of a new week, and there were many loads to be delivered, so I was trying to get everything done quickly. I started driving at 3 p.m., planning to reach my destination that same night. I didn't want to stop on the side of the road to sleep, so I pushed the speed limit by about 5 miles per hour, which is quite fast for a semi. Or a thimia? After midnight, I started feeling really tired, but the destination was less than an hour away, and I figured I could push through. My eyes were getting dry, and it was becoming a struggle to keep them open. I splashed some water on my hand and rubbed it on my face to wake myself up a bit. My truck was the only vehicle on the road at that hour, so aside from my headlights, the road was completely dark. I remember reaching for my water bottle to take a sip and almost spitting it out when I saw a figure approaching from a distance. I slammed on the brakes, and as the truck slowed to a near stop, I could make out the details of the person standing almost in the middle of the road. He was dressed in all black, with some sort of black scarf wrapped around his neck, and his neck was unusually long. It was a strange thing to notice, but it was truly unsettling. However, his face was just a blur. I couldn't make out any features. As the truck slowed down and got closer to this mysterious man, I was about to roll down the window to ask if he needed a ride, but he suddenly turned to his left and dashed into the woods. I didn't take another second to think about it. I just hit the gas pedal and moved on. Even though it was creepy, I was in a hurry. It wasn't until about 20 seconds later that my heart really started racing as I processed just how strange the whole situation had been. Maybe 5 minutes passed before I managed to shake it off, but then something else happened. As I got back up to speed, I saw something dart across the road in front of me. At first, it looked like a large animal, but as I got closer and it disappeared into the woods, I realized it looked like another person. I didn't even hit the brakes this time. I just kept driving, possibly speeding up a little more, because I was starting to get scared and wanted to reach my destination faster. A few more minutes went by without incident, but I was getting more and more tired. At times, I even veered into the other lane a bit. With about 40 minutes left to go, I started wondering if I could make it any further. I began looking for a good spot to pull over and park for the night. Eventually, I spotted a small gravel opening on the side of the road that seemed like a tiny parking area. I pulled the semi into the space, parked it, and leaned back to rest. I barely slept for an hour before I suddenly woke up in the darkness. I still don't know what woke me, but something in my gut told me to turn on the headlights. So I flicked the switch, and the lights illuminated the area in front of the truck. There was something standing right in front of the truck, a man. It was the same man with the black scarf that I had seen earlier standing by the side of the road. Now I could see his face more clearly. He had a wide grin on his face, and his eyes were opened as wide as possible, staring directly at me through the windshield. I immediately started the truck and pulled out of that spot as fast as I could. I had no idea what to think. How could he have walked 10 miles from where I saw him last? That night, I didn't stop again until I reached my destination. After arriving, I slept in the parking lot and woke up early the next morning. The only reasonable explanation I could come up with was that my mind had been playing tricks on me, because I had been seeing strange things all night. But I've never heard of a hallucination so vivid and terrifying, and that's the part that still leaves me feeling confused and scared. Before I landed an office job in the city, I worked as a UPS delivery driver for 2 years. It was decent money, and for the most part, I enjoyed it. But like any job, it had its rough moments. This was back in 2010, 2 years after I graduated from college. I was working a shift from 11 a.m. to 7 p.m. on a Thursday. It was the middle of winter, so by 5 p.m. it was already dark outside. I didn't live in some sunny place like Palm Springs, but rather a small town in North Carolina. I wouldn't exactly call it a slum, but it definitely wasn't the nicest area. I often delivered packages in this same town. The housing situation in the area was kind of strange. In some parts, there were rows of houses and mobile homes spaced far apart, while other sections were completely deserted. This made deliveries take longer, because the houses were so far from one another, compared to the average suburban or urban area. Delivery locations were always marked on the map, so I could plan a more efficient route instead of aimlessly driving around. After making deliveries across 3 different small towns over the course of many hours, I found myself on one of those roads I mentioned earlier. On one side, there were scattered mobile homes and small houses, and on the other side, there was just forest. It was already past 6 p.m., and my shift was winding down with only a few deliveries left. There was one house on this block, and the package required a signature, meaning I couldn't just leave it at the door. I pulled up in front of the house, went to the back of the truck, and hauled out one of the biggest and heaviest boxes of the day. There were small metal pieces rattling around inside, lots of them. I couldn't begin to guess what was in the box. My job was to carry it to the front door of the mobile home, and that's exactly what I did. This place didn't have a doorbell, so I knocked. There weren't any lights on inside, and I didn't see a car parked out front either, so I hoped someone was home. I knocked again, a couple more times, and finally saw the curtains in one of the windows move, followed by footsteps approaching the door. Then there was a long pause, a suspicious, unnecessary pause, before the door finally cracked open. An older woman peeked out. When I told her she had a package that needed signing, she opened the door fully. She seemed nervous as I handed her the device to sign. Her signature was messy. After signing, she asked me to help her carry the box inside to her room. I figured this might happen. The moment I stepped inside the mobile home, I was hit with a terrible smell. You know how every house has its own smell, good or bad? Well, this one smelled awful. I couldn't figure out what it was. She led me through the tiny living room, into a narrow hallway where I struggled to carry the box, then brought me to a door. She opened it and asked me to place the box inside the closet at the back of the room. I asked her to turn on the light, but she said the light didn't work. The room was nearly pitch black, with only a faint glow from the living room light spilling down the hall. I could barely see my way around to maneuver the box into the room. As I approached the closet, I noticed someone standing in the corner. I knew for sure it was a person because of the outline and the slight movement. There was no logical explanation for this. The person was clearly hiding from me, waiting. I left the box where it was, walked past the woman and said, "Have a nice day." She started screaming at me to come back and help her, even going so far as to curse at me. I didn't know what she or the person in that closet had planned, but I had no interest in sticking around to find out. I finished my shift and went home that night, and that's when I started searching for a better job. I've been a truck driver since I was 26. And throughout my years of night driving, I've had my fair share of strange experiences. I worked for various companies, frequently driving across state lines to deliver goods to different businesses or stores. One day, I was assigned a job to drive from one end of California to the other to deliver a trailer full of wooden furniture. Most of the drive took me through vast desert roads. It was going to be a long journey, and I had started late in the day. so I knew most of the trip would take place after dark. Given the nature of desert roads at night, straight and mostly deserted, I could afford to push the truck a little faster than I normally would. So when I saw the flashing taillights of a car up ahead in the distance, I had to hit the brakes hard to bring the truck to a stop. When I finally pulled up behind the vehicle, I saw it was an old Chevy Impala parked on the side of the road in the desert dirt, with its hazard lights on. Naturally, I got out of the truck to check if anyone needed help. I walked over to the car and tapped on the window, but got no response. I bent down a little to peer inside through the tinted window. It didn't seem like anyone was in the car. I checked the other seats and confirmed that the car was empty. I scanned the dark, chilly desert surrounding the road, but I couldn't see much beyond 20 meters ahead. For some reason, I felt particularly helpful that night, so I went back to my truck to grab a heavy-duty tactical flashlight from the toolbox under the passenger seat. This flashlight was so bright that if you looked directly into it, it could hurt your eyes. As soon as I switched it on, the beam revealed an abandoned gas station on the side of the road. Apparently, I hadn't noticed it before. The reason might have been that the entire fill-up and parking area was just dirt, with no concrete in sight. There were only 2 gas pumps, and behind them stood a small building, likely an old convenience store at some point. It made sense that the person who owned the car would be inside that building. I headed for the front door, which was permanently stuck open, and shone my flashlight inside. It illuminated a good portion of the room, revealing a large convenience store like those you'd find at many gas stations, though it was long past its prime. It wasn't surprising that it didn't last long on a road like this. I called out to let anyone know I was there and offering help. For some reason, the faint echo in the room gave me chills. Then I heard something. It sounded like a shoe scraping against the floor, coming from the other side of the room, behind a few shelves that once probably held snacks and drinks. I called out again, offering help if anyone needed it. Then I heard a low, heavy whisper. I understood the words immediately, but I couldn't comprehend why someone would say that. I also heard the sound of heavy breathing coming from a corner of the room. That was enough to make me hurry out of there. As I walked back to my truck, there was about 5 seconds of confusion. I wasn't sure if what I had heard was real or not. I ran back to the truck and called 911 because, honestly, I was too scared to go back inside the building. They asked for my exact location, but I couldn't give them anything specific. All I could say was that I was near an abandoned gas station on some road in the desert. They asked me to stay on the line to provide more details about my location. Suddenly, the car in front of me started up and sped down the desert road. I hadn't even noticed the driver get into the car. It was so dark, and I was distracted by the phone call. I rushed back into the building to check if anyone was still inside while keeping 911 on the line. I headed to the back section, where I had heard the voice and breathing earlier, and was horrified to find a fresh pool of blood on the floor. I could only imagine what had happened. I explained over the phone that I believed I had stumbled upon a crime scene. Eventually, a team of state troopers arrived at the scene. They asked for any information I could provide, such as a license plate number or a description of the suspect. All I could tell them was that it was a black Chevy Impala, probably from the early 2000s, and that I had heard a man tell me to leave just before hearing a woman scream as they left the building. There was no body left behind, but I had a few ideas of what might have happened. I'm sure the state police took blood samples and followed up, but I wasn't able to provide much more help. It's a shame I didn't have a dash cam at the time to capture the license plate, but the very next week I installed one in my truck. This was one of those once-in-a-lifetime experiences that will haunt me forever.